Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into one of the most serious and complex questions in global security. Can Russia actually use nuclear weapons, and what would drive such a decision? This topic has been discussed endlessly by analysts, politicians, and military experts, but there's still confusion and fear around it. So today, we're breaking it down clearly, calmly, and realistically, using everything we know about Russia's nuclear doctrine, global deterrence, and the real-world factors that shape decision-making in the Kremlin. Russia is one of the largest nuclear powers on Earth, with thousands of warheads in its arsenal and a long legacy of nuclear strategy dating back to the Cold War. But having nuclear weapons and deciding to use them are two completely different things. Russia's nuclear policy has always been built around the concept of deterrence, making sure no enemy dares to attack because the consequences would be catastrophic. This doesn't mean Russia would never consider using nuclear weapons, but it means the threshold is extremely high and surrounded by layers of political, military, and strategic barriers. The core of Russia's official doctrine states that nuclear weapons can be used only under specific circumstances. If the existence of the Russian state is threatened, if there is a large-scale attack on Russia's territory, or if nuclear weapons are used against Russia or its allies. This sounds straightforward, but the real question is how Russia interprets existential threat. In modern warfare, that definition becomes blurry, especially during high-pressure conflicts like the ongoing war in Ukraine. Still, Russia has repeatedly emphasized that nuclear use is a last resort, not a tool for regular warfare. One of the biggest fears people have is whether Russia would use tactical nuclear weapons, smaller, battlefield nuclear bombs, if its military faces defeat. Tactical nukes are designed for use on the battlefield, rather than destroying entire cities. They are still incredibly destructive, but they're seen by some strategists as usable. This is where much of the concern comes from. Russia has the world's largest stockpile of tactical nuclear weapons, and many analysts wonder whether they could be used to shock opponents or force a negotiation. However, using tactical nuclear weapons wouldn't be as simple or beneficial as it sounds. First, it would break a global nuclear taboo that has existed since 1945. The moment Russia detonates a nuclear device in Ukraine or anywhere else, the world changes instantly. Russia would face immediate diplomatic isolation, massive economic retaliation, and likely direct military consequences. Even countries that stay neutral today would be forced to take a stand. Nuclear use isn't just a military event, it's a political earthquake. Another major factor is NATO. Russia understands very clearly that even a limited nuclear strike could trigger a response from NATO, not necessarily nuclear, but devastating enough to destroy key Russian military positions. NATO has superior conventional firepower, and a nuclear strike would give NATO the legal and political justification to escalate massively. The Kremlin knows this. That's why every Russian nuclear threat, every mention of escalation, is carefully framed to intimidate rather than initiate action. There's also the internal decision-making structure. The authority to use nuclear weapons in Russia is concentrated in the hands of the president, but the process involves multiple layers of confirmation, codes, and key holders. This system was designed to prevent accidental or unauthorized launches. Even within the Russian leadership, there is a strong understanding that nuclear use would bring unpredictable consequences. Many elites, military officers, and security officials have no interest in triggering a conflict that could destroy the country they are part of. Russia also relies heavily on nuclear weapons for deterrence because its conventional forces, despite being large, have faced significant challenges in recent conflicts. This makes nuclear weapons a symbol of strength, not something to be used recklessly. If Russia uses nuclear weapons irresponsibly, it risks undermining the very strategic balance that protects it. Nuclear weapons lose their deterrent power when they are actually used, because the world then responds with force, sanctions, and potentially regime-threatening consequences. There's another critical point. China and India, these two major powers, are among Russia's most important economic partners. Both are firmly against nuclear escalation. If Russia uses nuclear weapons, both countries would distance themselves immediately, potentially collapsing what remains of Russia's international support network. For Moscow, losing China's and India's economic and political backing would be catastrophic. That alone creates a massive barrier to nuclear use. Still, it's important to consider the scenarios analysts worry about most. One is if Russia believes that its leadership is in danger, or that the collapse of the state is imminent. In such an extreme situation, the doctrine allows for nuclear use. But this is the most desperate scenario imaginable, one where the Kremlin feels cornered with no way out. Even then, using nuclear weapons doesn't guarantee survival. It could accelerate collapse by sparking a global coalition against Russia. Another scenario involves miscalculation. In times of war, miscommunication or mistaken assumptions can lead to escalation. However, since the Cold War, both Russia and NATO have developed strong communication channels, early warning systems, and protocols designed to prevent accidental nuclear confrontation. Even during the tensest moments of the Ukraine conflict, both sides have continued using diplomatic and military communication to avoid misunderstandings. Despite the aggression and heated rhetoric, both sides understand the consequences of crossing the nuclear line. Propaganda and fear play a big role in modern warfare. Russia often uses nuclear threats to frighten Western governments and influence public opinion. These threats are tools of psychological warfare, not real war plans. The Kremlin knows people fear the unknown, and nuclear weapons are the ultimate symbol of fear. In reality, every time Russian officials make nuclear threats, they are carefully choosing words meant to influence, not initiate. Let's also talk about Russia's strategic interests. Nuclear use would destroy any chance of Russia shaping global politics or maintaining influence. Russia wants to appear powerful, not irrational. Nuclear use would send a message that Moscow cannot control its own escalation. This would damage Russia's credibility within its own alliances and among countries that try to maintain neutrality. Even Russian allies in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia would question their partnerships. There's also a practical problem: nuclear fallout. Using a nuclear weapon close to Russia's own borders, like in Ukraine, could send radioactive clouds into Russian territory. Winds don't care about borders. Fallout could contaminate Russian farmland, Russian cities, and even military bases. The Kremlin understands this risk very well. Nuclear weapons are not tools you can use next door without suffering consequences yourself. So, what does all this mean? Could Russia use nuclear weapons? Technically, yes. Any major nuclear power has that capability. But practically, politically, strategically, economically, and militarily, the barriers are enormous. Every incentive pushes Russia away from using nuclear weapons, not toward them. Nuclear use would bring devastation not only to the target, but to Russia itself. That's why the nuclear threats we hear are usually rhetorical tools, not real indicators of imminent action. In the end, nuclear weapons are mostly about signaling. Russia signals strength to avoid appearing weak. It signals danger to discourage NATO involvement. It signals unpredictability to keep opponents cautious. But the actual threshold for using nuclear weapons remains extremely high. Even during the toughest moments of the Ukraine war, Russia has avoided crossing that line. The world is right to take nuclear threats seriously, but it's also important to understand the reality behind them. Nuclear weapons are not political toys, and using them would fundamentally reshape global history for the worse. Russia's leaders know that, the international community knows that, and every decision made regarding nuclear weapons is guided by one overriding truth. There is no winning scenario once a nuclear weapon is used. Ultimately, the real power of nuclear weapons is not in their use, but in their existence. They deter, they warn, they influence decisions, but the cost of crossing the nuclear threshold is so catastrophic that even the most aggressive leaders hesitate to go near it. That's why, despite all the fear and uncertainty, the world has avoided nuclear war for nearly 80 years. Russia's nuclear capabilities are real, but so are the consequences. And at the end of the day, every rational actor, from Moscow to Washington to Beijing, understands that nuclear use leads to a world no one wants to live in. The most important thing is maintaining communication, reducing misunderstandings, and keeping the threshold as high as possible. And for now, despite the tensions, that threshold remains firmly in place. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay informed, stay aware, and stay safe.